2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
We welcome back this young, sprightly, energetic, virile person to the studio. Been away all over parts of the world on location. Professor of Politics, Jim Jokes. G'day, Jim. Where have you been?
G'day, Mark. Well, London for a time and Africa, visiting Nairobi and the Kenyan Public Service Commission and renewing acquaintances there and establishing new contacts with the new commission which came into force, the new members of the commission that came into force on 1st of January. And then I spent a little bit of time at the State University of Zanzibar visiting colleagues and renewing research connections. And then I was back in London for a little while and observing a few of the things that were going on there, particularly with Brexit and the climate change material.
Because if you kind of a week too late or a week too early leaving, you've got Trump visiting the Queen at the moment, so you could have been over. You could have sorted them all out.
Yes, well that will be interesting to observe firsthand because there are lots of different, shall we say, perceptions and reactions to Mr. Trump's visit. In particular, while the Queen as head of state is obliged to play her role, it appears that Donald Trump is not necessarily playing his role in a diplomatic way. His comment about the Lord Mayor of London seems to be a bit...
I could call him a loser, I think.
Well, it's sort of inappropriate for leaders to behave like that when they're guests in another country. And there are other dimensions. The Speaker of the House of Commons, who is a very erudite person, let it be known that he would not be in favour of opening the Commons to the President to come and speak.
Now, kind of politicians and behaviour is kind of a loose segue to what we'll talk about this morning, in that politicians seem to... We need to make sure that they're adhering to the same kind of rules that the rest of us do.
Well, I was sort of brought to think about this a little bit, Mark, when I was after the most recent federal election, and we often look at the elections as means of holding our government and politicians to account, and we change governments in part as a mechanism to ensure that incumbent governments don't get too complacent. The message that sort of came out of the last election was that neither of the major political parties were particularly popular, but the coalition scraped back in through preferences and that they were the least worst of the least unpopular. But it got me thinking about...
This has been a trend. It's been a trend.
But it got me thinking about other forms of accountability and the ways in which governments have found ways of bypassing means of being accountable. And in particular, we look at the media and investigative journalism in particular as mechanisms that expose government misdoings or improprieties or whatever, so that governments and their ministers and their leaders can be held accountable in other ways. But there seems to have been a shift over the past couple of decades, and I say this in the context that governments have always been hostile to criticism and always looking for ways to silence those who would speak truth to power, so to speak. But over the past couple of decades, we've seen shifts in which governments are prepared to act in very arbitrary ways. The most extreme case might be, for example, Julian Assange and his particular predicament, and there are lots of complexities there. But the fact that he is the personal target of particularly the US government, possibly the UK government, certainly no support from the Australian government because he's spoken truth to power in various ways, but he's not seen as a journalist in the same way that, shall we say, others are. So he's sort of out on a limb, and at the moment the particular pursuit that the US is going after him with suggests that any journalist, anybody who exposes any secret, is going to be fair game.
Certainly at that very hot and that extreme end anyway.
And we've seen the very extreme actions of the Saudi Arabian government with one of its former citizens and a journalist in the US. But in Australia, we've also seen, for example, and this has involved both political parties when they've been in government, when during the Howard years the Howard government authorised the use of Australia's Secret Intelligence Service to spy on the Timor-Leste government when it was in negotiation over oil treaties in the Timor Sea. Now, that was then exposed by a whistleblower as inappropriate use of government agencies, because it was ultimately benefiting a private interest, not just simply gathering intelligence for the government for it to make appropriate decisions and so forth and policy changes. The government then went after the whistleblower, not saying, OK, we've done the wrong thing, let's correct it, but they went after the whistleblower. But what was curious about this is that, the whistleblower's been tried behind closed doors, so to speak, and his lawyer is not able to see all the evidence. But what's really significant about this is that they've also targeted the ABC as one of the outlets that broadcast and made this news public. They haven't gone after other outlets that did the same thing. So they've been selective. So in a way, this coming back to holding governments accountable and speaking truth to power and all of that sort of thing, successive governments have been selective, and it's cut across party lines. So it's not simply one party doing the wrong thing or whatever. They've both
probably expect the same no matter who's in.
They've been consistently hostile, partly to the ABC. And the thing that I would sort of point to here, Mark, that we need to sort of think really seriously about is that it's not simply all those who made this public are being held, being targeted by the government, but only some. And that suggests an arbitrary approach. And it also suggests that successive governments believe that they are somehow not subject to the rule of law in the same way that its citizens are, that they are somehow above it because they're pursuing something, in their view, that might be more noble or more noteworthy. So one of the things that I think we need to be relatively concerned about is the extent to which governments see it as quite appropriate to act in arbitrary ways in which the rule of law is only applied selectively and not applied across the board equally to all concerned. And we can look at other instances where whistleblowers have been targeted themselves rather than the issues that they've raised being of primary concern. And it seems to be, if I can sort of wrap this up with just a sort of little observation here, Mark, it seems to be that there's a particular pattern in which one goes after the whistleblower and ignores the issues that the whistleblower's brought to light. So that's one of the things I think that parliamentarians need to start thinking very seriously about. They need to be actually being seen to be accountable, as well as coming along every 3 years just to get a tick or whatever to get re-elected.
Jim, obviously coughing. Well, thank you for your thoughts. We'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
2NURFM.